Hello. The title of the study that I'm going to present to you today is Introduction of Complex Vocabulary in Literature Through Fine-Tuning. And this is a corpus-based study or situated within the field of computational linguistics and natural language processing. So first of all, the subfield that I'm dealing with here is abridgment, which sounds a little bit strange as a noun, or the generation of abridged versions of literary texts that are usually targeting specific audiences, such as young children or foreign language learners or people who have a learning disability. Actually, I have just started my PhD on this general topic. And while I was being interviewed in the beginning of registering for my PhD, I was asked a very particular and narrow question that I found very refreshing. The question was, is abridgment ever associated with adding something to a text rather than subtracting from it? So this really actually got me thinking about what abridgment is. So is it necessarily a summary, although the two words are generally used interchangeably? And if the quantity of text is not always reduced, then summary would be an incorrect term. Maybe adaptation would be more adequate, but then again, adaptation gives off the impression of the text being more free, less centered on a particular original. And then again, sometimes one can speak about quantitative versus qualitative abridgment, when quantitative is considered to be reducing the volume of a text, and qualitative, reducing the complexity of a text. But once again, it is not a given that the quantity of a text should be reduced in all cases when we're talking about adapting it for a particular audience. So let us see some examples when an abridged text would require addition rather than subtraction. So first of all come illustrations. We have all seen children's books based on, let's say, classical novels, and just a number of illustrations in them that tend to aid young children in particular to make sense of the story. Then we could also have glossaries, which is maybe a separate section in the text that serves to aid learners, in particular learners of a language, to understand and learn some of the complex vocabulary found in a text. And then another example that is a little bit more subtle has to do with hypothesis of the linguist, the 20th century linguist Harris, that shortened versions of a sentence tend to carry the same information as longer counterparts while becoming more complex. So in terms of grammatical structure, so there are clear instances of a shortened sentence consisting of simpler, a longer sentence or number of simpler sentences that have been brought together through a process of reduction and shortening that retains the information while the text itself becomes more complex. Let us see an example here. John ate a sandwich. After that, John sat to watch the news on TV. And then a second option of conveying generally the same information. Having eaten a sandwich, John sat to watch the news. So a couple of differences here. We can see clearly the second text is a little bit shorter. So the name John is not repeated. The phrase on TV is not used as it is understood or assumed to be understood by the reader. And then And then we have shortening that conveys the temporal relation between the two parts of the text, that makes use of verb tenses and verb forms, having eaten instead of he ate and then he did something else. So from here, I have formulated the research question that I consider in this study. I examine a particular case of abridgment through addition that is based on a recent work in psycholinguistics by Leung et al. Of 2021 that says that parents introduce complex vocabulary to their children through the process of fine-tuning. That is to say, they actually provide additional context or an explanation along with the word that they say. For instance, instead of just saying the leopard, they may say the dotted leopard ran after the rabbit, or the leopard ran after the rabbit like a cat. These additions would help a child understand better what a leopard is, in case they don't know. So my hypothesis would be that literary works can also carry this characteristic, as there are many similarities between acquisition of spoken and written language, let's say, as per Krashen's theories of language acquisition. And also, does the study of foreign language fall within this framework too? Once again, according to similar theories, there is a clear link between the acquisition of one's native language and a foreign language. And additional questions that I will be asking is, if this feature is present in text, this tendency to introduce complex vocabulary to additional context, then to what extent is it there? In what percentage of cases, just very generally said? And are there any differences in relation to, on one hand, different audiences, let's say in text for children as compared with texts for foreign language learners? And then are there differences by language? Because as languages are different, possibly differently complex, they have what Krashen refers to as different natural order of acquisition. So there would be different tendency in the study of different languages. Now, let me describe my experimental setup. First of all, I compiled a corpus. I used famous literary works, novels that are particularly famous as children's novels that belong to roughly the same time period. So there is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, and The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. And also these texts are present both in the original English, as all of them are originally written in English, as well as in translations. So the languages I'm looking at are, apart from English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And then they're both full and abridged versions within the corpus. So they're the original works and translations of the original works, as well as abridged versions, up to 3 per novel, that are made for children or for foreign language learners. So for the experiment that I conducted, first of all, I pre-processed all these texts in the corpus, for instance, removing capitalization and punctuation. And then I applied part of speech tagging to them, that is, determined the part of speech of each word in each text. And then in order to look for examples of the sought feature, I only took nouns as they exemplified best. And also I took only the longest words, expecting them to, in many cases, also be the most complex ones, as per Zipf's law of least effort. Then I looked at the mistakes that ensued. For instance, there were some non-words that were caused by the textual processing, converting the files into textual files, and so on. Then there were some words that were, although labeled as nouns, were not actually nouns. For instance, the Spanish word aficionado, which could be a noun, but in the particular case it was an adjective. And then also there were quite a few common words that were indeed long, but definitely not suitable candidates for testing whether complex vocabulary is introduced in a certain way, such as Christmas or the Spanish word cumpleaños, birthday. And then another problem came from the fact that I took hyphenated words as one word. However, there were limitations to this, as in particular in French and Russian, there's some grammatical rules that mandate for words to be put together, to be connected with a dash, such as commensat elle in French, kakni bud in Russian, among many similar examples. Then my plan, once I had these lists of complex nouns as present in the original text, was to limit them to the nouns that are also present in an abridged version. So I looked at every possible pair of full and abridged version of the same novel in the same language. And I made lists of the nouns that are present in the full, the complex nouns that are present in the full and the abridged version. Then I found the context, I extracted the context in which these words were introduced in the two works, the full and abridged. And I juxtaposed them looking for this feature. I saw if in the abridged version, there was more context somehow as compared with the full version. And here is an example of the feature being present in the full version. And dash the wild year through there stood as there's no punctuation, that's why it sounds awkward. There stood a solitary lighthouse, great heaps of seaweed clung to its base. And in the abridged version, crushed violently underneath them, the spirit took Scrooge to a lighthouse built on a lonely rock several miles from land. So we have solitary lighthouse versus a lighthouse built on a lonely rock. And we can see that the second one is longer and it is easier to understand. Solitary might be problematic, but built on a lonely rock, lonely instead of solitary, a simpler vocabulary, but also an explanation of what is meant by the metaphor, a solitary lighthouse. Which it's also a metaphor, a lonely rock, but it is clearer to understand because of the additional context given. So after I checked all instances of this feature, I figured that there were 62 of them out of a number of 377 parallel introductions of complex vocabulary as found. And I categorized them into three general types that are sometimes a little bit hard to tell from one another. So one is addition of related vocabulary. So more context related to the same general linguistic field that can even sometimes border redundancy. For instance, brouillard versus épais brouillard. So the fog versus the thick fog. Just adding that the fog was thick helps understand what fog is, and helps through giving a word that is often associated with fog, a common collocation. Then in Russian, we have, for instance, гостеприимство versus щедрое гостеприимство. So hospitality versus generous hospitality. Hospitality usually within itself contains the notion of generous. So it is a bit of a repetition, but at the same time, it helps understand what the complex word means. Then another type of addition is grammatical transformation, or transformation into a simpler structure, as we saw in the case with Harris's transformation. For instance, in the Spanish text of Alice in Wonderland, we have tejer una guirlanda de margaritas versus juntar margaritas para trenzar una guirlanda. So to weave garland of daisies versus to gather daisies in order to braid a garland. The second version is longer but simpler in that it explains in more detail what is done. Gathering of flowers in order to make a braid, which is something that might be easier to understand by a child. And then the rarest percentage of cases was of an actual verbal explanation or definition, such as this addition in the Russian text, which, by the way, tended to be freer, less based on full versions. Суди заседаят, потому и называют се присяжни заседатели. So this is a bit of maybe not a pun, but an explanation of what the word means. So they sit in court. That's why we call them like people who sit in court or the jury. Then I have composed tables in order to analyze the results by language and then by reader group. First of all, when it comes to language, we can see that the number of instances of the feature is lowest in English and highest in French. And also the fact that results are comparable in terms of the percentage of prominence of the feature in French and in Spanish speaks of there being tendencies in relation to languages, as these two languages are the most similar ones. They're both Romance languages. They come from the same language family. And then explanations, once again, very limited in number and appear only in French and Russian texts. So maybe it has something to do with freer interpretation of the original. Then results by audience, they have clearer tendencies. So we can see that very few of the complex words are present in abridged versions for young children, so children 5 to 8. And then when it comes to foreign language learners, actually none of the words that were analyzed were found in the texts for learners, which shows by itself a link between foreign language learners and native learners who are of very young age. And then the feature is most prominent with higher level foreign language learners. Whole 40% of the considered words were introduced in this particular way. Here, a big limitation is that all the books that were meant for language learners were in English. Sadly, this was a limitation of the corpus that I hope to research ways to go around it in the future, look for texts for foreign language learners of other languages other than English. So as a conclusion, the characteristic that has been sought in literary texts, namely the introduction of complex vocabulary through additional context in order to aid younger learners or younger readers or foreign language learners, is indeed present in a non-negligible number of cases. And it seems to have a link with the level of the reader and with the language in question. So I feel that it can already be used as a so-called readability feature that can be used to determine how complex a text is or what the most suitable audience for a text will be. Then, of course, as mentioned, a larger corpus with a larger variety of languages and types of text would really help further confirm the findings of this study, as well as maybe come up with more narrow findings related to how different languages work in relation to this feature, for instance. Then always better NLP tools would be really of help, such as maybe not making use of the longest words in a text, but of word lists that would be more reliable when it comes to finding the complex words in a particular work. And then this study and this feature has been rather narrow, and it can be placed into a larger context. For instance, a study of Harris's transformations by type, and also just a general study on the influence of complex vocabulary on the text surrounding it. Because sometimes it really felt like maybe there isn't addition of context, maybe the size is the same or approximately the same, but still there is influence felt. For instance, if there is one complex word in a sentence, it feels like it is less likely for there to be two or more complex words within the same sentence. So these are just some ideas about future work. This is the bibliography. And yes, that was all. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be happy to answer questions if you have any.